Granville Smith who gave this house the name Solitude, and we have a letter from him from December 13th, 1808, and at the head of the letter he has the word solitude. And perhaps he thought that this house, positioned by a beautiful pond and away from the hustle and bustle of Richmond, was truly a tranquil place. Smith moved back to Eastern Virginia and rented this house to his heirs, and they sold it back to Preston in 1822. The house then was occupied by Letitia Preston and her husband, Dr. John Floyd, and they lived there several years before Smith's death. The next occupants were James Preston's son, Robert Taylor Preston, and his wife, Mary Sally Hart Preston. And they added a wing of the house in 1834. They expanded, and the whole house faced this direction. Robert Preston was founder of Olin and Preston Institute, which was a Methodist college. He founded that in 1854. And in 1851, he and Mary greatly enlarged this house to a Greek Revival style. This house is significant because it was the home of two Virginia governors, Governor John Floyd and his son, Governor John Buchanan Floyd. Robert Preston sold the property to form the new Virginia Land Grant College in 1872. And he sold this house and over 200 acres because he was very badly in debt. After the Prestons died, and Robert Preston died in this house, and until World War II, this structure served as faculty housing. From 1882 until 1886, it was the infirmary for the Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College, which was the forerunner to Virginia Tech. After World War II, right after World War II, this house was divided into apartments, and it became a center for returning World War II veterans who lived in trailers right around the house. Major repairs in the 1950s preserved the house's appearance, but there were long-term moisture problems, which you'll see when you go into the house. There was extensive termite damage and leaking of radiators over the years. In the 1960s and the 1970s, this house was the home of the Hockey Club. And one of the things the Hockey Club did was put in a patio, and they would have parties before the games right outside Solitude. In the 1970s, mid-1970s, this became an academic building, and it housed part of the chemistry department and part of the Department of Textiles. And then in the late 1980s, the Appalachian Studies program started to work to try to restore this building. It nominated it for a Virginia landmark, and it hired an architect named Gibson Worsham to place this building on the National Register. And when you look on the front porch, you'll see the plaques attesting to its regional and national significance. So that's a very whirlwind history of Solitude. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Professor Anita Puckett, who's going to talk about the significance, national and regional significance of the building.
This is one of those times when you might like to be back 100 years and we didn't have such competition. It might be easier to hear. Well, the regional and national significance of Solitude is massive. It's intense. But what I want to focus on in the few minutes I have today is that it was part of a kinship-based socio-political and socioeconomic complex of folk, of people, that represented in many ways how significant the Scotch-Irish contributions were to the early formation of the United States as a nation. This complex of people strongly influenced the formation of American polity, the configuration of democratic governance at state and federal levels, military protocols and regulations, and especially around here, the configuration of higher education in much of the South, and the moral and ethical expectations of a middle-class citizenry. Now, on the flip side of this, they, of course, with the complex, endorsed slavery, a landed gentry entitlements under law and by custom, and the construction of an elite southern upland wealthy class perpetuated by birthright, right, and by race. But Smithfield Plantation over there, as many of you already know, since we have your interpreters here and the director, was established by Ulster-born William Preston around 1774, and was one of several in this network of upcountry plantations owned by those of Scots-Irish and sometimes English descent, and for the most part they married among themselves in their family groups or into other Scots-Irish or possibly English families around them. This ethnic endogamy created a near Scots-Irish aristocracy that ensured that the regional flow of wealth, political privilege, and social status would stay within their group. The number of governors, Commonwealth and federal congressmen, lawyers, military officers, educators, and others of high political and social positions in the antebellum periods attest to the success of this network of kin. The Prestons residing at Solitude certainly benefited from and contributed to this network. And early Solitude was part of the Smithfield Plantation complex, and by the time of James Patton Preston's death in 1843, this complex consisted of 3 tracts: Smithfield, Whitethorn over there close to Heathwood, and Solitude itself. Each was owned by one of James Patton's sons, and therefore one of William Preston's grandsons. And by this time, Solitude was, of course, owned by Robert T. Preston. I want to share with you a bit of a quote that I find delightful, as long as we don't look at the underpinnings of the ethnic and race relations, of a delightful quote from Letitia Burwell of Bedford County in about probably the 1850s. It's in her memoir. And she came here and visited these tracts of Preston's, lived with them, and she said the houses of the 3 brothers, John, Robert, and William Ballard, were filled with company, winter and summer, making within themselves a delightful society. The visitors of one house were equally visitors at the others, and the succession of dinner and evening parties from one to the other made it difficult for a visitor to decide at whose particular house he was staying. One of these brothers, Colonel Robert Preston, had married a lovely lady from South Carolina, whose perfection of character and disposition endeared her to everyone who knew her. Although surrounded by all of the allurements which gay society and wealth could bring, she did not swerve an instant from the quiet path along which she directed others. And I'd like for you to think about that, about 1853, right here at Solitude, right after the addition of having Mary or Sally Hart Preston entertaining us this evening, at least in spirit, certainly not in body. And so we have then the kinship contribution of Solitude to the to the regional and national construction of our country. But Solitude also illuminates 18th and early 19th century ethnicities and identities in contact. The land on which Solitude was built, as Dr. Fine said, was originally part of a 507-acre tract at the headwaters, purchased or acquired by Caspar Barger, who was a German. And we have the kind of complexities that she hinted at of Germans perhaps building the house for James Patton Preston, perhaps building it for themselves, but certainly leaving their architectural legacy on the building. Now, as we move on, we also have the Shawnee in this general area with the Mary Draper Ingalls story and their legacy. And then as we move on, by the time we get Letitia Preston Floyd and her husband, John Floyd, the governor here, well, of course we have the African presence through slaves. And Robert T. Preston also had a slave presence. So right here on this grounds, we have the intermingling of several different ethnicities. And by exploring the history of Solitude and what it has to offer, we're exploring the complexities of the shaping of early American culture in the Upper South. So it also has that significance. And finally, before I turn it over to my colleagues, is the architecture itself. the changes in the architectural design, and then some of them we'll talk about. This is a house that's kind of messed up. It's got this, it's got that, it's been smoothed out here and added onto there. But the architectural design and styles of the house in the early to mid-1800s constitute a changing sense of American identity, based on such things as the Greek Revival style and before it the Federal style, and the historical reasons why people such as the Prestons would have adopted those. So on that, let me turn it over, if I may, to Dr. Rodriguez.
I'd like all of you to imagine yourselves 200 years ago, when the Prestons would have been sitting on this porch. Notice the orientation of this porch. It's in fact the same orientation of the little building, the servant's house that you see very close to this building. Not accidental. It would have been, I like to think, placed right there so that you would have enjoyed a sunset equally as beautiful as the one we're all experiencing this afternoon. The place came to be known as Solitude, but I would also like to think that Solitude would instantly be turned into multitude when special guests like you would come to visit the Prestons. Now, we are indeed very privileged at Virginia Tech to be the custodians of this treasure trove of material culture, because the grounds, the foundations, the walls, even the roofs of these buildings have written in them the history of this region. In some instances, even the prehistory. For the archaeology conducted by Professor Cliff Boyd has revealed there are artifacts from prehistoric times, some of them actually dating several thousand years ago. So a lot of history that is in these grounds. Now, being privileged to be the custodian of such a treasure trove of historical buildings on a historical site also entails a great responsibility. And that means taking care of these properties. When I came to Virginia Tech now some 20 years ago, I was privileged to be a part of the first initiatives to take a look in a serious way at the preservation of the historical properties within the Virginia Tech campus. This site being of special significance to Virginia Tech because, as Anita and Betty pointed out, symbolically it is the cradle of Virginia Tech. The purchase of this property in 1872 marked the beginning of the college, Mechanical and Agricultural College then, that ultimately came to be Virginia Tech, Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. The restoration, however, of these buildings is a very delicate enterprise, as well as an expensive proposition. In order to do justice to these buildings, one cannot overnight change all the old that you see and replace it by the new. We want to respect what is old of these buildings, and the little building that you're going to see standing next to this house is our showcase. It's the one that has been restored for all of us to appreciate, as you're going to be able to do this afternoon, and will give you a little bit of an idea of how we want to proceed with this big building. Work, of course, has already begun in this building as a whole. Just to give you some idea of what the restoration of a historical building entails, I've just charted a list of a few of the tasks. First of all, the study of the building. You cannot proceed without having done a most meticulous study of the building. That means digging into the construction practices and materials, measuring the building to determine its dimensions, researching aspects of its form and function across time. And there are three major dates that basically define the history of the buildings that we are seeing here before us. A study of the location and the environs, because it's not just the buildings in isolation that we're interested in preserving, but the context, which is this beautiful site that makes Solitude such a special landmark, not just for Virginia, in fact, I like to think, but a national landmark as well. The study of its age, when was it built? The historical context, who were the individuals that lived here? What were their ideals? Those are also reflected in the building itself. And then the archaeology that will reveal the burial cultural deposits around the building that will also tell us a lot about the history of the house and the human beings that lived here. The methods that are used to conduct such study and then the implementation of the research include archaeological excavations, artifact analysis, relative dating methods, wood identification and determination of factors that have contributed to the deterioration of the materials, a specialized technique, dendrochronology, that can help us actually pinpoint the date of construction of various parts of the building, basic chemistry of the materials that can also tell us what the material fabric of the building was at different periods of time. And now, of course, with some of the new technologies that we have, like the computers, we can generate three-dimensional modeling of the building that they allow us also to see at a glance what were these different periods in the history of the building like. Archival research, of course, also goes hand in hand with this. Measured drawings and photography. These are just a few of the tools that we use to prepare what we call a master plan for the restoration and conservation of the building. So I'd like to think that we are all embarked in this very important challenge. That is the responsibility of us all, because the preservation of the past is a responsibility for the future. So I'd like to now turn the floor to my colleague Bill Green, who's going to reveal some of the secrets behind the walls of the building.
What we're looking at here is Solitude number 3, right? This is the 1851 Solitude, what we call the Greek Revival style in the 1840s and 50s, up till the period of the Civil War. Americans were enamored with the idea of pretending they were living in ancient Greece, right? And although the building doesn't have a huge amount of detailing in Greek Revival style, it certainly fits that period. And when you go inside, you're going to notice a couple of things. First of all, what we call the Greek key, or the little shapes above the windows, a Greek detail feature. The square columns on the front here. We've got 6 columns across the front. George Washington had 8, but at Mount Vernon, right? But here we've got 6. But what we're looking at is an I-form house, and it's a fairly big house. They had a large amount of people living here, and but the thing to remember that this is the 3rd version. Now, the first version of this house is the 1800 building. And the 1800 building is very, very different. The logs for this building were cut over a 3-year period, although it was completed probably in 1800. And what did it look like? It probably looked just like the slaves' quarters over there. That's a log building. It's a story and a half. This one probably had a 2nd story, but with a very low ceiling. The only room that really survives from that very early period is that room right there. Although virtually all the details are different from what they used to be. Right? When you go in there, in a lot of ways it's going to feel like the rest of the house. But that's the log part, and there's one little spot in the wall here where you can peer through and actually see one of the logs that were whacked out in 1801. Right? In 1834, the house was massively enlarged with another log section which is on the other side. We call that the Federal style. It's not really a pioneer building anymore. It was built of log, but it was almost immediately covered over with white clapboard. Because in those days, nowadays we think log is sort of cool and it's old-fashioned and neat. Then it was just plain embarrassing, right? And they wanted to imagine their house was a nice, white, clean house with no rough, nasty-looking heavy wood, right? So the whole house was completely covered with white siding, right? And then in 1851, a whole new addition was built. Everything you see here from the left-hand side of that window to there was built all at once, including the porch, although there was probably a porch off this end of the building in the original version. It's a little hard to tell where the doors were in the old 1801 section. It's a little fuzzy. I'm not quite sure. I also think that the fireplace in it might have been moved. I think the fireplace was on the opposite side of the room. When you're in that bedroom, the top upper right bedroom, you'll see a beautiful Federal style fireplace. It's the finest one in the house. It probably used to be in this room, and it got bumped upstairs and replaced by a Greek Revival style fireplace that's there now. To our eyes, the Greek Revival fireplace doesn't look as good as the Federal fireplace. There's also another wonderful Federal fireplace on the other side, upper floor of the 1834 section, and you can poke your head in there and have a look at that. So anyway, it's very confusing. The first one is very hard to see, but when you go over and talk with Bert and see the slaves' quarters, you're really going to get somewhat of a feel of what this one was like. It was bigger than that, but not massively bigger. The 1834 house was a nice, clean, white house, and we'll see the facade of it from that side. And of course, we're obviously looking at the very pretentious 1851 bit here. I might also mention about the landscape here. That lake there wasn't there. The duck pond, that's an artificially dug duck pond. Strubles Creek was there, it ran through it. I believe this pond might have been there. They called this for a while the ice pond. It's not exactly certain, but it could have been. On the lower end of the drill field and all in this area here was farmers' fields. On the far corner of the drill field was John Black's house, the brother of William Black, one of the founders of Blacksburg, and that's the sort of the town of Blacksburg off in that direction. So here's the front door. We came in, right? We've got a nice entry here. This is now called an I-form house. It's an entry area with a room on each side. The fanciest room is the old log part. The other room is this one here. It had a fireplace up against that wall. It's been ripped out, but the fireplace is actually still there on the other side of that wall, right? Now, we'll go upstairs and see one of the bedrooms. Now, this bedroom you can only get at from the other side because this was split up into 2 apartments at one point. But we'll nip upstairs and take a look at that other bedroom. It has a really nice Greek Revival fireplace in it. Have a look at this fireplace. I really like this kind of work. This is the classic Federal style work. All these little tiny moldings, hundreds of them, stacked on top of each other. Most of these pieces, like this is one piece of wood, and that's one piece of wood, and that's one piece of wood. But it's a stack of various hand-cut pieces held together with little square nails, right? And just a beautiful thing, and you can see how the detailing is and wraps around the outside. But also you realize this is 1834 and we're in the middle of nowhere. Look how high the ceiling is. Yeah. You know, really amazing. And a totally different world than the 1851 world that you'll feel over on the other side.
Now, when I say it's the grandest room, you'll see some wonderful features here in the Greek Revival style. You'll notice the key design above the windows. And if you look at the wonderful woodwork at the bottom, the baseboards are magnificent. Compare those to the size of baseboards that we have today. You'll also see the nice paneled aprons underneath the windows and the low window sills. One of the big surprises when we began restoring this room was to discover that between each of the timbers was brick infill. Why do you think they had the brick infill? This is something we don't do today. What would fire? Possibly fire prevention. Possibly insulation is another good reason. Possibly the idea that if you really wanted to make a house solid and if you really had a lot of wealth, you would make it out of brick. So even though the exterior was sided, underneath it has these very strong brick walls. One of the things we discovered when we began the restoration was that there was a lot of termite damage, and if you will look over here along this wall, you'll see a piece of wood that's been completely eaten away by termites right over here. It's just completely gone. A large part of the floor was completely gone, and so we had to restore the whole floor. And you can see the floor that we've put down. It's pine, and it is a replica of the original pine floor. We have it covered up right now to protect it, and at some point when the work is finished, the floor will be stained to look the way it would have looked originally. It was a dark pine floor. You can see holes along the upper part of the plaster. That's where a false dropped ceiling was put in the 1970s. This was used as a classroom, and fluorescent lights were put in. So part of the restoration is to take out all of the artificial low ceilings and then restore a new plastered ceiling to look like it would have been. I just learned from the Grovers who used to live in Solitude and who were in the group preceding you, that when they lived here, and this was an apartment for them, this room was their kitchen. But when the university started using it for classroom space, this became a dark room, and you will see dark room sinks in that room.
But this room is interesting because, first of all, when they made the 1851 edition, they had to extend the ceiling of the old 1801 cabin, and where it used to be probably about this high, they raised it much higher to be in accord and symmetrical with the rest of the house. When they did that, they should have, or in many other houses, according to our historic architect, they would also have raised the floor so that it would have been level with the rest of the addition. They chose not to do that for whatever reason, perhaps financial. As a result, to make it look nice from the outside, these windows are higher than they are in the other part of the house. They added these little benches, perhaps for storage, but also, Mr. Worsham argues, for little ones to look out the window, so they could stand up and look out the window and see what was coming. This probably was a bedroom. Bedrooms were large. You had many children living. Go to Smithfield, you will see this. Many children living, sleeping in the same quarters. Over here is a fireplace. This is the one that Dr. Green was talking about. It is in the Federal style, and it's one of the most outstanding pieces of architecture in the house because it's in such good shape. When we strip it down, it's going to be a rather detailed and well-preserved piece of fireplace decoration. The Federal style, I don't know if he talked about this. I did a little bit of web work, and part of my argument about Solitude's national significance or regional significance is that the Federal style was borrowed from Great Britain, which was using old Roman architecture. After the War of 1812, we wanted to avoid all things British. So then we went to the Greek Revival style, imitating or redesigning the old Greek styles of architecture, in part because of the argument that Greece was the founding place of democracy. So you were making a symbolic statement by switching from Federal to Greek Revival that was affirming what all the Prestons affirmed was their version of American democracy, which is the one that's captured in our Constitution and by many other documents. Many of the Prestons were anti-slave. It was an institution that William Preston supported, but many other Prestons fought against it, and then when the Civil War came, they changed their mind because they had to take sides. But it was a complicated issue for them as a family.
Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the servant house at Solitude, a building that has special importance for us because it's really our showcase. This is the first building that has been fully restored here at Solitude, and we like to think it's going to serve as a model for the restoration of the main house. This is a building that was the combination of two traditions. It's a hybrid of two traditions, and it's referred to as a Midland log house. The two traditions are in the plan of the building, and you have to just look at what is behind the porch. That was the original structure. The chimney that you see sticking out from the roof is a replacement. It's not the original one. It would have been much larger than that, but exactly in the same location. It has also a second story that is half a story that is reached by stairs that is tucked just behind the weatherboards. This is a tradition that comes from the British Isles, so this is an English tradition. But the construction of the building, that is a structure of logs, the logs are covered with weatherboards. You are going to see the construction on the other side, from the inside, exhibits a tradition that is typical of German carpenters. And it's characterized by this system of notches, kind of a V pattern that you see here that has, of course, a positive and a negative, and locks the logs into place at the corners, as you see them here. So it appears that these two traditions happen to be reflected in the construction of this building. This was not the only other major outbuilding at Solitude. We know for sure that there was at least a third one that actually stood between this building and the main house, that can be seen in this old photograph dated 1904. And you see the little building here that now is gone. All we have is a ghost of this building. Most likely this is the one that would have been the summer kitchen serving the main house. Now, a lot of speculation surrounding the function of this building. In fact, that very function of serving as a summer kitchen was proposed for this building. Others speculated that it might have been used as a warehouse. It may have been also used perhaps as a structure to store a variety of goods. Even the possibility of serving as a doctor's office at one point in time was suggested. But the documentary research, complemented by the archaeological digs that were conducted surrounding this building, proved very convincingly that in all probability it had served originally as a slave house. So that's the interpretation that we are going to give to this building. It also went through two phases of construction. The original building was built, we believe, in the 1840s, probably early 1840s, between 1840 and 1843. Then in 1851, it underwent considerable expansion, like the main house. The porch was added in 1851, and so was this extension that you see to the left, and differentiated with a different type of weatherboards, right? Oriented vertically, as opposed to these ones that are oriented horizontally. Woods used here, white poplar, or yellow poplar rather, for the weatherboards. The logs that are the structure of the building itself are made of oak, which is of course a strong wood. It's also very resistant to insect infestation. So they were very concerned about those things in those days. Something that does not give you a complete picture of what the building looked like originally is the structure of the roof. Originally, this building had beautiful chestnut shingles. And perhaps one day we may be able to also restore that material, because as you can imagine, it would give it a very different appearance to the one it has now. Now this is metal, it certainly will be much more durable perhaps, but the appearance is not quite the same. I also want to show you here in the documents that I have a picture that shows one such structure, not this one. This is a photograph from the 19th century, but shows the erection of one of these log houses. A labor-intensive proposition. And you see the builders here are using these long posts. They have a V at the end so that they can hold the logs as they are being lifted into place. And of course, ultimately anchored using the notch system that I explained before. A photograph showing this building before its restoration. Perhaps some of you were able to see this building before it was restored. It looked like just a pile of logs. And some observers would look at it and say, why are you keeping this pile of logs? Well, we, however, would say, but these are very special logs. We are not going to give up